The void was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that came before a storm, before the heavens split open and fire rained from the skies, before the war horns howled and the banners of legions unfurled, catching the cold breath of the stars. It was the kind of quiet that did not bring peace, but a sense of inevitability, a breath held before the plunge. Leman Russ sat alone in his chamber aboard the Hofkel, his flagship, the great beast of war that had carried him across the void for decades. The air was thick with the scent of Fenrisian incense, of burning oils meant to steel the mind before battle. Around him, the dim glow of hololithic projectors traced the surface of a world he had never set foot upon, Dagar Thryn, a planet lost to history, its name little more than a whisper in the great annals of the Imperium. And yet, it was here that he had been sent, by the will of the Emperor himself. Russ flexed his hands, the bones in his fingers grinding like the shifting of tectonic plates. His body ached, not from age, for the sons of the Emperor did not truly age, but from something deeper. A weight settled upon his chest, heavy as the chains of duty, and for once he did not know if it was the familiar bite of warlust or something far more bitter. A test. That was what the Emperor had called it. You are to find Horus, my son. Find him, speak with him, and see what lies in his heart. He had spoken those words with the weight of a god, his golden gaze unreadable, his expression one of deep knowing. Russ had never questioned an order before. He had never questioned his purpose. He was the Emperor's executioner, his enforcer, the bringer of ruin to all who would defy the Imperium. But this was not a war. This was something else, something worse. Russ exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air. He could hear the distant hum of the Rathkel's engines, the rhythmic pulse of the void-born machine. The runes carved into his armor flickered dimly, their ancient symbols of Fenrisian lore whispering of fate and the turning of the stars. A knock came at his door. No one knocked aboard the Threfkel. His warriors did not need to. The sons of Russ moved as one, their bonds as strong as the pack. But this knock was different, formal, deliberate. Russ turned his head slightly. Enter. The door hissed open, revealing the towering figure of Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the youngest among Russ's wolf guard, yet one of the fiercest. His golden hair was damp with sweat, his face set in a mask of contemplation. "My lord," Bjorn said, stepping inside with the reverence due to his king. Russ did not speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, studying the fire that flickered in Bjorn's eyes. "You have doubts," Russ finally said. Bjorn hesitated, then nodded. "I do," he admitted. "Not about you, my king, nor about our purpose, but about the War Master, about why we were sent." He folded his arms, his gauntlets creaking. "This is not how we do things." Russ grunted in agreement. "No, it is not." Bjorn exhaled sharply. "Horus and you are closer than most. You have fought together for decades, torn apart foes that others would have feared to face. If there is any among us who can see the truth in him, it is you." Russ leaned forward, resting his forearms on the great war table before him. Do you know why the Emperor chose me? He asked, his voice low. Bjorn frowned. Because you are his executioner. Because you are the one who does what must be done. Russ shook his head slowly. No. His eyes darkened, the gold of them gleaming like wolf's fire. It is because I am not blind, my brothers. Because I know what it is to doubt, to question, to feel the weight of expectation like a yoke around my neck. He exhaled, shaking his head. The Emperor does not believe Horus is lost. Not yet. That is why I am here. To see if there is still a brother in him, or only a traitor. Bjorn clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching against the haft of his frost axe. And if he is a traitor? Russ met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, there was no jest in them, no laughter, no warmth of a warrior's brotherhood. If he is a traitor, Russ murmured, then I will do what I was made to do. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet hum of the ship. Bjorn nodded once, the fire in his eyes hardening into something resolute. He turned, stepping back toward the doorway. We will be in orbit within the hour, he said. The sons of Horus have already landed. They are waiting for us. Russ rose from his seat. He did not need to speak the order. Bjorn already knew it. It was time. The sky of Dagar Thrinn was the color of rusted iron, thick with the scent of blood and ash. Leman Russ stepped off the landing ramp of his Stormbird, his boots sinking into the wet soil. The wind howled around him, whispering through the bones of the dead that littered the ancient battlefield. Before him on the broken plain stood the warriors of the sons of Horus. Their sea-green armor gleamed beneath the dying sun, their bolters held at ease, but their stance rigid with purpose. At their head, standing apart from the rest, was Horus Lupercal. Russ had seen him 1,000 times before, had fought beside him through the ashes of countless worlds. But as he gazed upon the War Master now, there was something different. Horus's face was unreadable, his expression carefully composed. His dark eyes, once filled with the fire of conquest, were quiet, measured. Russ stepped forward. Horus did the same. For a moment there was nothing but silence between them. Then Horus smiled. "Brother," he said, his voice smooth as ever, carrying the weight of ages. "It has been too long." Russ did not return the smile. "Yes," he said. The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of war. And in that moment, Russ knew this was not a test. This was something else, something worse. The air was heavy with the taste of iron, thick with the scent of old war, of blood that had long since dried into the bones of the land, of rusted armor left to crumble beneath the weight of history. The sky above Dagar Thrinn hung low and oppressive, a bruised and battered expanse of darkened clouds, lit from within by the occasional flicker of distant storms. The world was dying, though perhaps it had already died long before the first imperial banners had touched its soil. Leman Russ stood upon that forsaken ground, his boots pressing deep into the damp earth, the weight of his war plate sinking him into the marrow of a world that had seen too much ruin. Around him, his warriors held their silence, their bolters resting in the crook of their arms. their pelts stirring in the wind that carried the distant echoes of the past. The great Frakel loomed in the heavens behind them, its engines humming low and steady, like the breath of a slumbering beast, waiting for the call to wake. Before them, standing beneath the dull light of a sun that no longer shone with warmth, was Horus. Russ had not seen his brother in years, had not spoken to him beyond the clipped exchanges of war councils and the distant vox-hails of the Great Crusade. And yet in that moment, as he looked upon the War Master standing there with the full weight of his own legion at his back, it felt as though an age had passed between them, an age carved out of the space that lingered between duty and doubt, between the certainty of purpose and the whisper of something deeper, something that clawed at the edges of knowing. Horus was as he had always been, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence like the gravity of a distant star, drawing men into his orbit with the inevitability of fate. His armor, dark green and edged in black, bore the scars of war as if they were laurels, testament to the countless battles fought in the name of the Imperium. The golden wolf head of his cloak billowed slightly in the wind, its fur rippling like the mane of a great beast. But it was his eyes that held Russ's attention. Those deep, unfathomable pools of shadowed thought, where once there had been fire, now there was something colder, something measured and heavy with the weight of 1,000 secrets. Russ exhaled slowly, watching as Horus took a step forward. "Brother," Horus said at last, his voice a smooth and rolling thing, deep as the ocean and just as unfathomable. There was warmth in it, but not the warmth of old camaraderie, not the easy familiarity of warriors who had bled side by side across the endless stars. No, it was the warmth of something deliberate, something calculated, as though every syllable was placed with the precision of a blade seeking the weak point in a suit of armor. Russ did not answer immediately. He let the word settle, let it find its place in the air between them, testing its weight as a hunter tests the wind before the throw of a spear. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, the instinctual response of a warrior who had learned to read the unsaid things, the spaces between words where truth often lurked like a predator in the undergrowth. "It has been too long," Horus continued, taking another slow step forward. "Far too long since we have stood upon the same soil without war screaming at our backs, without the endless tide of conquest pulling us ever forward. And yet, here we are, in a place where the echoes of war still linger, where the dead whisper beneath our feet. Tell me, brother, do you feel them? The ones who died long before our kind ever set foot upon this world? Do you wonder if they look upon us now as we stand upon their bone?" Russ narrowed his eyes. He did not move, did not speak. He only watched. Horus sighed then, as if releasing a weight that had settled deep into his chest. His gaze lifted toward the horizon, where the ruins of some long-forgotten city slumbered beneath the encroaching shadows of time. "There was a time when I would have called this a tragedy," he murmured. "A world lost, a civilization erased, its name nothing more than a footnote in the annals of conquest. But I find myself wondering, Russ, was this truly a loss? Or was it merely an inevitability, a cycle playing out again and again, with different faces, different banners, but always the same end?" Russ inhaled deeply, the cold air filling his lungs, tasting of storm winds and the distant promise of rain. He rolled his shoulders slightly, feeling the weight of his armor shift, feeling the familiar presence of Mjolnir resting against his back, the great frost blade that had carved its legend through the flesh of 1,000 foes. "You speak like a man who has spent too long looking into the dark," he said finally, his voice low, rough-edged, like the growl of a wolf beneath a hunter's moon. "A man who has let the cold settle into his bones, who has begun to wonder if the night is not so terrible after all." Horus smiled at that, a small, knowing thing, as though he had expected those very words. "Perhaps," he admitted, "or perhaps I have simply come to see the truth for what it is, that the light we serve is not the salvation we were promised, that the hand that guides us is not the benevolent hand of a father, but the grip of a tyrant who would see us chained to a destiny not of our own making." Russ clenched his jaw. He could feel the way his warriors behind him shifted ever so slightly, their instincts sharpening, their bodies tensing like the coil of a hunting pack sensing the scent of blood on the wind. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down upon him, pressing down upon the space between them, the vast and silent space that was no longer just physical, but something deeper, something that stretched between their very souls. "You walk a dangerous path, Horus," Russ said quietly, his voice barely above a growl. "You speak words that should not be spoken, think thoughts that should not be thought. I have known you too long, fought beside you in too many battles to mistake this for mere curiosity. Tell me, brother, what is it you seek? What truth have you seen that has planted this shadow in your heart?" For a moment, just a moment, there was something in Horus's gaze, something almost like sorrow, like the quiet grief of a man who has already seen the end of things and knows there is no way to turn back. And then it was gone. "I seek only what is right," Horus said, his voice still smooth, still calm, but now laced with something deeper, something heavier. "I seek only to free us from the chains that we have been bound in since the day we were created. Tell me, Russ, have you never wondered? Have you never asked yourself why we were made? Why we were scattered? Why we were shaped into weapons to be wielded and then discarded when our usefulness has ended?" Russ exhaled slowly, his fingers curled tighter. "I do not wonder," he said, "because I have never needed to." Horus tilted his head slightly, watching him with that same unreadable gaze, and for the first time, Russ felt it. The weight of what was coming, the slow and terrible inevitability of a storm that could not be stopped. The first stone had been cast, and there would be no turning back. The wind carried the scent of decay, of ancient blood soaked into the bones of Dagorthrin, its soil rich with the history of civilizations long since buried beneath the march of war. The sky above hung low and sullen, its color that of tarnished iron, rolling with slow, roiling storms that churned like restless thoughts. Distant thunder rumbled across the horizon, a deep and guttural growl, as if the heavens themselves stirred in uneasy slumber. The ground, pitted and scarred, bore the remnants of battles fought centuries ago. Broken stones, the shattered husks of ancient fortifications, the skeletal remains of warriors whose names had been forgotten by all but the dirt that held them. The world was a graveyard, and yet It breathed with the echoes of those who had stood here before, whispering in the wind, murmuring in the trembling earth beneath their feet. Omen Russ felt it, the weight of history pressing upon him like the vastness of the ocean, like the weight of the pack pressing against the lone wolf who stands at the edge of the hunt. He was no stranger to such places, to planets left hollow and spent after war had raged through them like wildfire. He had stood on countless battlefields, smelled the same air of death and ruin, felt the same quiet hum of something lingering beneath the surface, something old, something waiting. Yet here in this moment on this world, the silence felt different. It was not the silence of emptiness, nor even the silence of waiting, but the silence of understanding, of inevitability. It was the silence of things already in motion, of wheels that had begun to turn long before he had set foot upon this cursed land. Across from him Horus Lupercal stood as he always had, strong, composed, his stance one of effortless authority, as if the weight of the cosmos rested upon his shoulders and yet did not bow him. His armor, rich in its dark green hue, bore the marks of 1,000 campaigns, each dent, each scrape, each scorch mark a testament to the battles he had fought, to the empires he had broken, to the victories that had shaped the Imperium itself. The golden wolf pelt that draped across his shoulders, its fur matted with age, whispered of Fenris, of the time when they had fought together beneath the same sky, brothers not only in war but in blood and bond. But the man beneath the armor, the soul within that unshakable form, was no longer the Horus he had known. Russ could feel it as keenly as a hunter feels the shift in the wind before the storm breaks. But there was something deeper in Horus's eyes now, something heavier, something colder. Horus exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chill of the dying light, his gaze drifting beyond Russ, beyond the gathered warriors, beyond the ruins that stretched out toward the horizon, as if he were looking at something neither seen nor spoken. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth as ever, deep and deliberate, a voice that once could have commanded armies with a single word, that had once carried the weight of the Emperor's will without hesitation. "I often wonder, brother," Horus murmured, "if we have ever truly known what it is we fight for, or if we have simply followed the path that was carved for us, blind to the hands that shaped it." His eyes flickered with something unreadable, something distant. "I wonder if, in all our years of conquest, in all the wars we have fought, we have ever once stopped to ask whether the Imperium we build is a dream worth dying for, or if we are simply the tools of a man who never intended for us to see beyond the war itself." Russ studied him, feeling the weight of the words settle into his chest like the heavy pull of the deep tide drawing a ship toward the rocks. There was no jest in Horus's tone, no feigned levity, no trick of rhetoric meant to disarm or mislead. There was only truth, his truth, spoken with the slow certainty of a man who had looked into the abyss and found something staring back. "I have never needed to ask," Russ answered, his voice a low, rumbling thing, like the distant growl of a predator in the dark, "because I have always known, because I do not need to seek meaning where meaning is clear. We fight because we were made to fight. We build because it is the task given to us. We forge the Imperium not for ourselves, not for our own ambitions, but because it is what must be done." He took a slow step forward, his boots grinding into the dust, his gaze steady and unyielding. It is not our place to question the wisdom of the All-Father. It is not our place to doubt the purpose for which we were created. We were not born to rule, Horus. We were born to serve. Horus let out a quiet breath, something close to a sigh, though not one of weariness or exasperation, but something heavier, something that spoke of a sorrow that had settled deep into the marrow of his being. He turned his head slightly, the dying light casting long shadows across the sharp lines of his face, the flickering storm above reflecting in his eyes like twin pools of darkened fire. "And that is where we differ, brother," he said softly, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Russ. "Because I have come to see that service without understanding is no better than slavery. Because I have come to see that blind loyalty is the tool of those who do not wish us to see. Because I have come to know that if we are to be the architects of mankind's future, we must be more than weapons. We must be more than hounds at the heels of a master who does not tell us why we fight, why we bleed, why we die." He paused, his fingers tightening slightly against the pommel of his blade, the weight of his thoughts pressing against the air between them. "You say we were not born to rule, but tell me, Russ, if not us, then who? Who among men could wield the power we possess and not be consumed by it? Who among mortals could hold the weight of the Imperium and not crumble beneath it?" Russ felt something stir in his chest, something primal, something instinctive, the echo of an old and unshakable truth. His lips curled slightly, something like a grim, knowing smile, though there was no mirth in it, no humor, only the certainty of a man who has never once questioned his own place in the world. "The Emperor," he said simply. "He alone, always." Horus's expression did not change, but for a moment, just a moment, Russ thought he saw it, the flicker of something beneath the surface, a shadow, a crack in the foundation, the smallest fracture in the unshakable presence of the war master of mankind. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, swallowed by the weight of the moment, by the inevitability of what lay ahead. The wind howled between them, the ruins around them whispering their secrets, the ghosts of the past watching in silent witness. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke, but both of them knew. The storm had already begun, and there would be no stopping it. The air between them hung thick and unmoving, the very wind seeming to hesitate, as if it too recognized the weight of the moment, as if it understood that something ancient and unchangeable stood at the edge of its precipice. The ruins of Dagarthrin loomed around them like the ribcage of a forgotten titan, the remains of a once great city now reduced to crumbling stone and shattered walls, the remnants of a people who had long since been erased from the pages of history. Rusted weapons and broken armor lay scattered among the ruins, half buried beneath centuries of dust, their presence a silent testament to the wars that had been fought upon this soil long before either of them had set foot here. The sky, painted in hues of sickly gold and blood-dark red, bore the slow, seething churn of distant storms, the thunder rolling like the growl of some unseen beast waiting beyond the horizon, its presence a promise of things yet to come. Horus stood with the ease of a man who knew the weight of his own presence, his stance effortless, his armor catching the dim light and casting shadows that danced like specters upon the cracked stone beneath them. He was watching Russ, studying him in that careful, deliberate way he always had, his gaze piercing and knowing, the kind of look that could strip a man down to his bones and see the things he did not say aloud, the doubts he buried beneath steel and duty. And Russ, though he stood as he always had, feet planted firm, shoulders squared, the weight of Mayaner pressing against his back, felt something stir within him, something he did not yet have a name for. He had never feared Horus, had never doubted him, had never once questioned the bond they had forged in war, the brotherhood that had been carved in blood and fire across 1,000 battlefields. But now, here, standing before him in the dying light of a ruined world, he felt it, a shift, a fracture, a rift that had already begun to open between them, unseen and silent, yet as real as the blade strapped to his back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, taut and waiting, thick with unspoken words, and the weight of understanding that neither of them wished to fully acknowledge. And then, at last, Horus exhaled, slow and measured, his breath curling into the cold air like the final sigh of a dying fire. "Tell me, Russ," he said, his voice softer now, quieter yet no less heavy with the thoughts that lingered behind it. "Do you ever wonder if we were ever meant to last? If the dream we were given, the empire we were told to build, was ever truly meant to stand the test of time? Or if, from the very beginning, we were simply marching toward an end that was always waiting for us, one we could never escape, no matter how hard we fought?" Russ did not answer immediately. He let the question settle, let it find its place in the air between them, let it sink into the marrow of the moment. He understood the weight of it, the place from which it came. He had known Horus long enough to see the shift, to recognize the depth of the thoughts that had taken root in his brother's mind, the thoughts that had been cultivated in silence, growing in the dark corners of his heart where no one else could see. "I do not wonder," Russ said at last, his voice rough-edged, low like the distant growl of an animal, not yet sure if it must bare its fangs, because wondering is the privilege of those who do not already know the answer. And I have always known. From the moment I first set foot upon the battlefields of the Great Crusade, from the first time I looked into the eyes of those who stood against us, from the first time I saw the fire in the Emperor's gaze when he spoke of what we were building. We are not meant to wonder, Horus. We are not meant to question. We are meant to act, to carve order from chaos, to bring the Imperium into being, not because it is easy, not because it is perfect, but because it is necessary. Horus's gaze did not waver, but there was something in it, something deeper now, something edged with a quiet kind of sorrow. "And that is why we are different," he murmured, shaking his head slightly. "Because I have come to see that necessity does not always mean righteousness, that order does not always mean justice, that the path we walk, the one we were given, is not the only path that could have been." He turned his gaze to the horizon, to the dark shape of the storms moving slowly toward them, their lightning splitting the sky in jagged streaks of pale gold. "I have seen things, Russ. Things I cannot unsee. Truths that have shattered the foundation of what I once believed to be unbreakable. I have looked upon the nature of what we are, of what we were made to be, and I have realized that the war we fight is not the one we were told it was. We were given a vision, a purpose, but we were never told the cost. We were never told the price we would pay, not just in blood, but in the very essence of what we are. Russ narrowed his eyes slightly, feeling the slow, creeping sensation of unease coil around his ribs. "And what is it you think you have seen, brother?" he asked, his voice a shade quieter now, though no less firm. "What is it that has turned your thoughts so far from the course we were meant to walk?" Horus was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost distant. "I have seen the chains, Roos," he said. "The ones we have worn since the day we were made. The ones we did not even know existed, because they were forged in the mind, in the soul. I have seen the Emperor for what he truly is, not the father we once believed him to be, not the guiding light we were told to follow, but the architect of a prison so vast, so absolute, that we did not even realize we were bound within it." He turned his gaze back to Russ, and for the first time there was something in it that Russ did not recognize, something vast and unfathomable, something that carried the weight of a man who had already made his choice. "I will not be a prisoner, Russ. I will not be a slave to a vision that is not my own, and I will not stand by and watch as you, as our brothers, as all of mankind is shackled to a destiny that was never meant to be ours." The wind howled through the ruins, and Russ felt it, felt the finality in Horus's words, felt the shape of what was to come, felt the first tremor of the storm that had already begun to break. He looked into his brother's eyes, into the dark depths of them, and for the first time in his life, he saw it. Not a warrior, not a leader, not the war master of mankind. He saw a man who had made a choice that could not be undone, a choice that would change everything. And in that moment, Russ understood. The next time they met, they would not meet as brothers. They would meet as enemies. The world of Daggerthrin breathed in slow, labored gasps, as though it were a dying thing, a vast and ruined beast left to wither beneath the weight of its own decay. The sky, bruised and heavy with thunder, stretched across the heavens like the mottled hide of some ancient leviathan, its swirling storm clouds yawning open in slow, deliberate churns, swallowing the last remnants of daylight in their ever-hungry maw. The wind carried the scent of dust and rusted iron, a taste of old death and forgotten wars. The ghosts of shattered legions whispering through the hollow remains of what had once been a world of empire and ambition. Now it was nothing but a carcass, a skeletal husk upon which two gods stood, watching one another with the wary intensity of predators circling the final moment before the pounce. Lemon Russ could feel the storm in his bones, though whether it was the one overhead or the one building between him and Horus he could not tell. The tension had a weight to it, an invisible gravity pressing down upon them both, shaping the space between them into something taut, something almost fragile, though he knew there was nothing fragile about this moment. It was the forging of something new, something terrible, something inevitable. Hello. It was the shift of fate itself, the snapping of some great, unseen thread that had once bound them together. And Russ, though he had never feared anything in all his long years of war, felt something stir deep in the marrow of his being, something ancient and wordless, something that was neither fear nor rage, but something more, something like grief. Horus stood with the same ease he had always carried, as though the weight of the galaxy upon his shoulders had not yet bent his back, as though he had already accepted whatever truth lay ahead of him, no longer resisting it, no longer questioning it. And yet, Russ could see it, could see the flicker of something beneath the mask, beneath the carefully measured facade of calm. A shadow, subtle, a man standing at the precipice, staring into the abyss, and seeing something within it that no one else could see. For a long while neither of them spoke, the wind their only companion, its voice whispering through the ruins, through the broken stone and shattered bones, through the banners of the dead that still clung to rusted poles, their fabric torn and tattered, yet still stubbornly resisting the inevitability of time. And then, at last, Horus broke the silence, his voice carrying not as an order, not as a challenge, but as something deeper, something more like confession. You always believed in the Emperor, Russ. His words were slow, deliberate, as if each one were being weighed before it left his lips. Always, more than any of us, even when the others doubted, even when they whispered their grievances behind closed doors, even when the cracks began to form, you stood firm. You never wavered, never questioned, never sought answers beyond those that were given. I admired that once, you know. I envied it even. That certainty, that simplicity of faith. But tell me, brother, when you look at him now, when you stand before the great crusade and see what we have become, what we have done, do you truly still believe? Do you still hold that same unwavering trust in the vision he gave us? Russ did not answer immediately. He let the question settle, let it breathe, let it sink into his thoughts like the first drop of blood upon snow, staining everything it touched. He could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet challenge woven beneath the surface of Horus's words, the invitation to doubt, to step away from the unshakable path he had always walked. And yet, when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, his gaze unbroken. "Yes," Russ said, his tone devoid of hesitation, though there was something else within it now, something deeper, something quieter. "I believe." Horus smiled then, but it was not the smile of a man amused or satisfied. It was something else, something sad, something almost pitying. He exhaled, tilting his head back slightly, letting his gaze drift toward the dark sky above them. "Then I envy you still," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost distant, "because I cannot." Russ's brow furrowed slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides, not in anger, not in threat, but in something more uncertain, something more restless. "And what is it that has stolen your belief, War Master?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though still firm. "What shadow has crept into your heart that you can no longer see the light?" Horus's gaze returned to him, those dark eyes holding something vast, something heavy. He took a slow step forward, his armor shifting, the weight of it evident in the way the ground seemed to shudder beneath him. "I have seen the truth, Roos," he said, and there was no boast in it, no arrogance, only the quiet certainty of a man who had already crossed the threshold from which there was no return. "I have seen what lies at the heart of this imperium we build. I have seen the throne that awaits him, the chains that await us all. We were never meant to rule, you say, but I have come to understand that we were never meant to serve either. not as we do, not as we have been made to. Russ's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding slightly as he felt something cold settled in his gut, something sharp and unwelcome. "You speak in riddles," he said, his voice edged with something like frustration. "Say what it is you mean." Horus let out a quiet breath, shaking his head ever so slightly. "What I mean, brother," he said, "is that we were never free, that we have never been free, that we are not warriors, not kings, not sons of a great and noble father, but weapons, tools, things fashioned for a purpose that was never ours to shape, and that if we do not break the chains now, if we do not take back what should have been ours from the start, we will never be anything more than the hounds of a god who has no love for us, only use." Russ felt his heart beat slow, the weight of the words pressing against his ribs like the cold hand of something vast and unseen. He had never doubted before, never, but there was something in the way Horus spoke, something not of madness, not of rebellion, but of certainty. And certainty, he knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. For a long while he said nothing, the storm above them growing louder, the distant thunder rolling like the voices of gods watching from beyond the veil of the sky. And then, at last, he exhaled, slow and deliberate, his breath curling into the cold. "This path you walk," he said, his voice low, measured, steady, "it is one of ruin." Horus did not smile, did not argue, did not try to sway him. He only nodded once, slow and knowing. "Perhaps," he said, "but it is mine." The wind howled. The storm broke, and the world changed. The storm broke upon them like the slow exhalation of a dying god, a rolling tremor in the heavens, a vast inhalation of the void itself, drawing in all that had been and all that was yet to come. The clouds above Dagar Thryn churned in great billowing masses, torn apart by the unseen hands of forces older than time itself, shifting in slow spirals of roiling darkness, their shapes whispering the language of ancient things, the tongues of forgotten gods, the dialects of wars waged before man had even been a dream in the mind of the universe. The sky bled streaks of burning crimson, as though the fabric of the heavens itself had been torn open, and through the gaping wound something vast and silent watched, something with no form, no voice, and yet an awareness that sent a tremor through the very bones of the land itself. The wind howled with the voices of the dead, their words lost in the rushing tide of time, and in that moment the planet did not feel like a world at all, but a battlefield upon which the fate of empires had already been written, in the language of fire and steel. Leman Russ stood firm, his feet planted like the roots of the oldest trees upon Fenris, the cold weight of his war plate pressing against his shoulders like the mantle of inevitability, like the crushing weight of duty and expectation made manifest in iron and ceramite. The wind pulled at his cloak, at the thick pelt of the Fenrisian beast that had once fallen beneath his own hand, its fur now tattered and worn but still defiant, still holding the scent of home, of frozen seas and endless tundra, of the distant echoes of the howling packs beneath a sky pierced by the cold light of 1,000 uncaring stars. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down upon him, the understanding that this exchange, This meeting beneath the corpse light of a dying world was no longer just an argument between brothers, no longer just a battle of words or ideologies. It was something far greater, something far older than them both, something that had been waiting, something that had always been inevitable. Horus stood across from him, and in the stormlight he was both familiar and unfamiliar, both the brother Russ had once known and something altogether different, something altered, something distant and yet vast, like a mountain seen from afar, unchanged in its form, yet seeming to loom higher, darker, more terrible when one stands before its base and looks up into the heavens, his armor still bearing the sigil of the Luna Wolves. No, of the sons of Horus now, for he had remade even his own legacy in his image, gleamed dark and polished, its surface reflecting the flickering light of the storm, the faint glow of distant lightning tracing along the blackened edges like veins of molten gold running through the body of a slain god. The wolf pelt draped over his shoulders was not like Russ's, not worn and weathered, not carrying the scent of the hunt of the wild. It was pristine, untouched, a symbol rather than a story, an emblem of dominion rather than the scars of survival. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, their gazes locked, their silence stretching between them like the taut pull of a bowstring not yet loosed. The final breath before the strike of the hammer, the endless pause before the first howl of the hunt. And then, at last, Horus spoke. "Look at this world, brother," he said, his voice low, deliberate, rolling like the distant echo of thunder that rumbled beyond the horizon, his eyes not on Russ, but on the ruins around them, on the broken bones of the past. "Look at what it was, what it has become. Tell me, what do you see?" Russ did not answer immediately. He let the words settle, let them breathe, let them sink into the marrow of the moment, into the bones of the land beneath his feet. He turned his gaze, letting it roam over the ruins, over the shattered remains of a city that had once stood proud, over the remnants of walls that had once been fortresses, over the crumbling pillars that had once reached toward the heavens, monuments to a civilization that had believed itself eternal, only to be broken, consumed. He saw the echoes of war, the weight of time, the remnants of an empire that had stood against the tide and had been swept away, its bones left to rot beneath the stars, that had already forgotten its name. "I see the past," Russ said at last, his voice a low rumble, his words steady, unyielding, spoken like the grinding of stone against stone, like the shifting of tectonic plates beneath the vast weight of the world. "I see what was and what will be again, a world that rose and a world that fell, a cycle older than any of us, older than the Imperium, older than even the Emperor himself. This is what happens to all things, Horus. This is the way of war." Horus let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly, the barest flicker of something like amusement ghosting across his features, though there was no humor in his gaze, only something deep, something vast, something terrible. "And that is where we differ," he murmured, finally turning his gaze back to Russ, his eyes dark, knowing, filled with something that was not doubt, not uncertainty, but conviction. Because I refuse to accept that. I refuse to believe that this, he gestured to the ruins around them, to the crumbling bones of a dead civilization, to the endless cyclical destruction of all things, is the only future that awaits us. I refuse to believe that we were made for this, that we were shaped and molded and unleashed upon the stars, only to build something that will inevitably be torn down, only to raise an empire that will one day be nothing but dust beneath the boots of whatever comes after. His fingers curled slightly, his gauntleted hands tightening into fists, not in rage, but in something deeper, something older, something like defiance itself. We are not meant to be the hands that build monuments for the ashes of tomorrow. We are meant for more. Russ's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides, his instincts pulling at him, telling him to move, to act, to do something before the moment slipped beyond his grasp. "And what is it you think we are meant for, brother?" he asked, his voice lower now, quieter though no less firm. "If not to build, if not to fight, if not to carve order from chaos, then what?" Horus' gaze did not waver. "To take what was always meant to be ours," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no room for doubt, no space for anything but the finality of the words. "To shape the future as it should be, not as we have been told it must be." Russ exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling upon him like the first snowfall upon the tundra. Silent, inevitable. "You walk a path of ruin, Horus," he said, his voice steady, though there was something else beneath it now, something heavier, something deeper. "And you do not see it." Horus smiled then, but it was not a smile of joy, nor of triumph. It was something else, something quiet, something knowing. "Perhaps," he said, "but at least it is mine." The wind howled, and the first blade was drawn. The sky above them writhed like a wounded beast, the thunder rolling through its storm-washed belly in slow, ponderous waves, deep and resonant as the footfalls of gods long since turned to dust. The light that poured through the cracks in the heavens was no longer the gold of a dying sun, nor the pale silver of the stars, but something else. Something broken and wrong, a flickering, ephemeral thing that seemed caught between moments. It was the kind of light that did not simply illuminate, but revealed, exposing the unseen edges of the world, sharpening the bones of the land, peeling back the veil that separated the past from the now, and the now from the things yet to come. The ruins of Dagger Thryn trembled in that half-light, their edges drawn long by the shifting glow, their crumbling towers casting jagged, twisting shadows that stretched across the pitted earth like the fingers of dead kings, grasping toward the sky in one final, silent plea. The remnants of old wars lay scattered in the dust, half buried beneath the weight of centuries. Blades whose edges had long since dulled, banners whose colors had faded into nameless gray, the skeletal remains of warriors whose names had been swallowed by the endless tide of history. It was a world of echoes, of specters, of things that had once been, and things that would never be again. And in the midst of it all stood two titans, two beings who had once called each other brother, now standing upon the precipice of something neither of them could yet name, though both knew what was coming. Leman Rust felt the weight of his warplate pressing against him, the cold iron of Mjolnir's grip resting heavy in his hand, his fingers curled around the hilt like the talons of a beast that knew its prey had already begun to bleed. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with something deeper, something older, something primal. The wolf within him howled, its instincts sharpening against the edge of the moment, sensing the change in the air, the shifting of the hunt. It was a feeling he had known since the first time he had tracked prey across the frozen tundras of Fenris, since the first time he had felt the heartbeat of the world quicken beneath his feet, since the first time he had looked into the eyes of a dying beast and seen the truth of the universe reflected there in the final flicker of its gaze. Horus stood opposite him, his presence like a great and immovable mountain, a monolith of flesh and armor, his cloak billowing in the rising wind, the golden pelt upon his shoulders rippling as if it too were alive, as if it too could feel the storm that was about to break. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes deep and knowing, watching Russ not with anger, not with hatred, but with something quieter, something heavier. There was no doubt in them, no hesitation, no flicker of uncertainty. There was only resolve, cold and absolute, the kind of resolve that could not be argued with, could not be reasoned away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, at last, Horus spoke, his voice carrying through the air like the first crack of thunder before the sky split open. "You know how this ends, don't you?" he said, his tone quiet, measured, but heavy with the weight of certainty. "You feel it even if you won't admit it. You've known it since the moment you stepped onto this world. You knew it before you saw me, before you heard my words, before you looked into my eyes and saw what had already been set in motion." He exhaled slowly, the breath curling in the cold, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his blade, though he did not yet raise it. "I am not the one who has changed, Russ. You are. You who once saw the world so clearly, who once moved through the universe without question, without hesitation. You stand before me now and I see it in you, the doubt, the hesitation, the question you do not want to ask, but cannot help but hear whispering in the back of your mind." Russ did not answer immediately, his grip on Mjolnir tightening, the frost-rimmed runes along its surface glowing faintly in the storm's flickering light. He felt the words settle into him, pressing against the raw edges of something he had not yet given voice to, something he did not wish to name. And yet, the truth of it was there, undeniable, clawing at the edges of his certainty, gnawing at the foundation of the unshakable faith that had carried him across the stars for so long. "You speak of inevitability," Russ said at last, his voice a low growl, a sound like the breaking of stone beneath the weight of the world. "As if this was always meant to be, as if the choices we make no longer matter, as if the path before us has already been walked, and all we are doing now is tracing the footsteps left behind by something greater than us." He took a slow step forward, his boots grinding against the dust, his gaze never leaving Horus's. But I do not believe in fate, Horus. I do not believe in destiny. I believe in action. I believe in the strength of the hunt, in the power of the pack, in the will of the warrior to carve his own path, not because it is written, not because it is foretold, but because he has the strength to make it so. Horus smiled then, but it was not a smile of amusement nor of satisfaction. It was something else, something distant, something quiet. And yet here we stand, he said, his voice softer now, though no less certain. Two beings who were once brothers, now standing upon the edge of something neither of us can stop. You call it choice, I call it truth. He lifted his blade slightly, its edge catching the stormlight, the glow of the heavens reflecting in its polished surface. And the truth is this: I will not kneel, Russ. I will not bow. I will not be the servant of a throne that would see me as nothing more than a tool, a weapon, a thing to be discarded when my use has ended. I will not watch as my brothers, as my sons, as the dream we bled for is twisted into something cold, something lifeless, something that was never meant to be. I will fight for that dream, for a future of our own making, not the one that was given to us, even if that means standing against you. Russ exhaled, slow and deep, feeling the finality settle upon him like the weight of the storm pressing against the land, like the inevitability of the first drop of blood upon the snow. He could see it now, clearly, without question, without hesitation. There was no turning back. There had never been. This is the last time I will ask you, brother, Russ said, his voice steady, unshaken. Stand down. Walk away from this path before it is too late. Horus's smile did not fade, but something in his eyes darkened, something deep and unyielding. It is already too late, he said, and then without another word the blades sang, and the war began. The first strike was not just an act of war, nor was it merely the beginning of a battle. It was the shattering of something vast, something once thought immovable, the breaking of a foundation that had held the galaxy together for centuries. It was the snap of a tether that had for so long bound these two beings together, the last thread of brotherhood torn asunder by the inexorable hand of fate. And though there was steel and blood in that moment, though the clash of their weapons sent tremors through the very bones of the world beneath them, the true war had already begun before a single blow had landed. It had begun in the words spoken between them, in the truths revealed and the lies stripped away, in the spaces between their breaths where doubt had festered, where conviction had hardened, where something irreversible had taken root. The storm roared above them, a swirling vortex of shadow and fire, the sky bleeding crimson as the heavens churned in slow, ponderous spirals, as if the universe itself recoiled from what was unfolding beneath its gaze. The ruins of Dagger Thrinn trembled beneath the weight of their struggle, the shattered bones of a forgotten civilization rattling in the dust, the echoes of old wars swallowed by the fury of a new one. The wind howled through broken archways, through crumbling towers and fractured monuments, carrying with it the scent of ozone and burning metal, the acrid sting of something unnatural taking root in the fabric of reality itself. The land bore witness, as it always had, as it always would, to the unending cycle of war, to the rise and fall of empires, to the moments where history twisted and bent beneath the weight of the choices made by those who thought themselves beyond its reach. Leman Russ moved like the predator he was, a force of nature unleashed, his every step a ripple through the dust, his every strike the culmination of centuries of instinct honed to perfection. Malnar sang in his grip, the great frost blade carving through the air like the fang of a god, its edge wreathed in the cold light of Fenris, its runes glowing with the fury of the storm. There was no hesitation in his movements, no doubt, no second guessing, only the hunt, only the understanding that this was what he was made for, that this was what he had always been. He had known war before he had known words, had learned to read the battlefield before he had learned to read the stars, and now, here, upon this dying world, he fought not for glory, not for honor, but for something deeper, something woven into the very essence of his being. And yet, for all his strength, for all his fury, Horus met him as an equal. The War Master was not a man, not in the way lesser beings were. He was a titan, a colossus carved from the will of the Emperor himself, a warrior whose every motion was a statement of purpose, whose every strike was a declaration of dominion. His weapon, the black talon, was a blur in his hands, its jagged, crimson-stained edge meeting Mjolnir in a clash that sent sparks screaming into the storm, that shook the ground beneath them with the force of something primeval, something beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. Horus was not just strong, he was precise, controlled, deliberate. Where Russ fought with the unchained fury of the wild, with the relentless, instinct-driven onslaught of the apex predator, Horus fought like the master tactician he was. Each movement calculated, each step measured, his power wielded not as a hammer, but as a scalpel. The clash of their weapons sent tremors through the ruins, sent stone crumbling from the walls, sent the air itself rippling with the force of their blows. They moved as gods, as forces of nature, their battle not one of simple skill or strength, but of ideologies made manifest, of convictions wielded as weapons, of unbreakable wills colliding with the force of colliding stars. There was no hesitation, no room for mercy, no place for the ghosts of what had once been. This was not a duel between brothers. This was war. The wind screamed around them, a howling vortex of dust and debris, the storm breaking in full, its fury mirroring the battle below. Lightning split the sky in jagged, writhing veins of golden fire, illuminating the battlefield in flickering bursts, casting their shadows long against the crumbling ruins, turning them into titanic silhouettes locked in an eternal struggle. The thunder rolled in waves, deep and resounding, as if the heavens themselves wept for what had been lost, for what could never be reclaimed. And yet beneath the roar of the storm, beneath the clash of steel and the thunder of the heavens, there was something else. A silence, a quiet that lived beneath the chaos, a whisper of something deeper, something neither of them could name. Horus struck, his blade carving through the air in a downward arc, his strength driving it forward like the weight of inevitability itself. Ross caught the blow on Mjolnir, the force of it sending a tremor through his arms, through his bones, through the very core of his being. Their eyes met in that moment, the space between them filled not just with the heat of battle, but with something heavier, something colder. "You still do not see," Horus said, his voice barely audible over the storm, but no less powerful for it. "You still do not understand. This is not about power. This is not about conquest. This is about freedom, Russ. It is about taking what was always meant to be ours, about breaking the chains before they become unbreakable, before we become nothing more than relics of a past we did not choose." His blade pressed harder against Mjolnir, their weapons locked in a contest of will, neither giving an inch, neither willing to falter. "Can you truly not see it? Can you truly still believe that this is the way things were meant to be?" Russ gritted his teeth, his muscles burning with the strain, his breath coming in slow, measured bursts. "I see a man who has forgotten what it means to be a son," he growled, his voice low, his words edged with something that was not anger, but something deeper, something colder. "I see a warrior who no longer fights for his people, but for himself. You speak of freedom, but all I hear are the words of a man who has already lost himself, who has already stepped so far into the dark that he can no longer see the light." Horus's gaze did not waver, did not falter. "Then I will show you," he said, and with that, he pushed forward, the force of his strike sending Russ stumbling back, the ground beneath them cracking beneath the impact, the storm above screaming in fury. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. The storm raged above them with the fury of a god's dying breath. The sky no longer a mere reflection of the battle below, but a living, writhing thing, twisting upon itself, thick with lightning that carved searing veins of gold and crimson through the shifting darkness. The air was electric with the raw force of something ancient, something vast, something that had waited in silence for this moment, for this inevitable breaking of oaths and bonds. The ruins of Dagar Thryn groaned beneath the weight of it all, the very earth shuddering beneath the footfalls of giants, stone trembling as if caught in the pulse of something far greater than war, something woven into the very marrow of the stars themselves. Leman Russ staggered back, his boots grinding into the broken earth, his breath coming in slow, steady exhales, each one measured, each one purposeful. His chest burned with the exertion, his body aching with the kind of fatigue that was not merely physical, but something deeper, something that clung to the edges of his soul like frost creeping across the ice fields of Fenris. His grip tightened around Mjolnir, the great frost blade humming in his grasp, its runes pulsing with a cold light that seemed almost alive, the whisper of old gods curling through the air like distant echoes from the void. He felt the weight of everything pressing upon him, the burden of duty, the unshakable certainty that he had been sent here not merely to confront his brother, but to pass judgment, to deliver the Emperor's will in the only way that could now be understood. But still, even now, even with the battle raging around them, he hesitated. Horus stood before him, his presence a towering force, his armor glistening with the haze of blood and stormlight, his form wreathed in a shadow that was not entirely his own. He was not winded, not shaken, not broken. He was as immovable as he had always been, as sure as he had always been, and yet there was something there, something lurking beneath the surface, something that had not been present when this battle had begun. His breathing was slow, measured, but there was weight to it, an exhaustion that was not of the body, but of the spirit. And his eyes, those dark, calculating eyes, held something within them that Russ had never seen before. It was not regret, it was not doubt, it was sorrow. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm roared, the wind howled, the ruins trembled. But between them there was silence. "You knew this would come," Horus said at last, his voice low, carrying through the howling wind like the final note of an elegy. "From the moment you set foot on this world, from the moment you saw me standing here, from the moment the Emperor gave you your orders, you knew." His hand tightened around the black talon, the jagged blade gleaming with the reflection of the storm, its edge stained with the blood of 1,000 battles. "You knew, and yet you still hesitate." Russ exhaled, his breath curling into the cold, his grip tightening ever so slightly around his weapon. "I do not hesitate," he said, his voice steady but low, quieter than before, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to Horus. "I never hesitate." Horus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, though there was something in his gaze, something deep and knowing. "Then why haven't you struck?" he asked. "Why haven't you done what you came here to do?" Russ did not answer, because he did not know, or perhaps he did. Perhaps deep down he knew the truth of it, the truth he did not wish to name, the truth that had been gnawing at the edges of his thoughts from the moment their blades had first met. He had always believed in the hunt, in the certainty of purpose, in the unshakable path laid before him. And yet, standing here, looking upon his brother, he felt it unraveling. "I swore an oath," Russ said at last, his voice quieter now, rougher, as though it scraped against something deep within him. "I swore to be the weapon of the Emperor, to do what must be done no matter the cost. I swore to hunt the traitor, to tear out the throat of the wolf that turns upon its own pack." He lifted Miautnar slightly, its blade glinting in the dim light of the storm, but his stance did not shift, did not advance, and yet here I stand. Horus let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the grip of his weapon. "You see it now, don't you?" he said, and there was something almost soft in his tone, something that did not belong in this moment, in this battlefield of gods. "The truth of it, the truth of us." Russ's eyes flickered, his muscles tensing as though he could feel the weight of something unseen pressing upon him. "And what truth is that? That we were never meant to be what we have become." Horus took a step forward, slow, deliberate, though his weapon remained at his side, the blade tilted downward, its hunger momentarily stilled. "That we were not made to rule, nor to serve, but to be something more, something greater. That we were never meant to be the tools of another's vision, never meant to fight for a dream that was never ours to begin with." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You have always been the most loyal of us, Russ, the one who never questioned, never doubted, the one who did not seek to understand beyond what was given. But now that you stand here, now that you see what this is, can you truly say that you do not feel it? That you do not feel the wrongness of it all? Bruss's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching against the hilt of Mjolnir, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to call it lies, to call it madness, to strike Horus down and bring an end to this war before it could begin, and yet the words did not come, because part of him knew. He knew that the Emperor had not told them everything. He knew that Horus was not entirely wrong, but that did not mean he was right. Bruss lifted his blade, his breath steady, his stance firm. "You may believe what you wish, brother," he said, his voice colder now, the edge returning, the certainty reforged. "But I will not turn." Horus nodded once, as though he had expected nothing else. "Then you leave me no choice." And with that they clashed again. The storm screamed around them, the world itself shaking as their blades met once more, as their wills crashed against each other like two colliding stars. And in that moment, in that terrible, endless moment, it no longer mattered what was right, what was true, what had been lost, and what had been found. It only mattered that one of them would fall, and the galaxy would never be the same again.